All right. Well, thank you all for being here today for I think this is our third now, one of these mini workshops or webinars. We're not quite sure what to call them yet, but appreciate the feedback we have been getting. And as we were just saying here a few minutes ago, I think for certain topics, for certain things, this kind of quick and online format works pretty well. So we'll be continuing to kind of listen to folks' input on how this is appealing to them. But I wanted to talk today about this idea of grading models, and in particular, this idea of what's usually called alternative grading models. This came up mostly because, and again, another reason why I like this kind of focused short model is these are a little less time intensive to put together, and so we can respond a little more quickly to kind of ongoing needs at the university. And so the issue of grading and feedback for students has come up a number of times in some faculty meetings recently. And so we thought it'd be good to explore some different issues about grading. Sometimes grading issues in terms of students and providing feedback can be dealt with through Brightspace, and we've got plenty of tutorials and modules up on our CAT Wiki and in our Lex Advanced course to teach you all about using the gradebook in different ways and providing feedback in different ways, using rubrics and all those sort of things. Sometimes, though, I think there's kind of a deeper issue that faculty want to consider. And so that's why I wanted to talk today a little bit about these alternative grading models and how they can help students and also how they can help faculty, especially in terms of time. There are a variety of different issues with the traditional model of grading in academia, right? And I think in a lot of ways we see it more because students have kind of dealt with it throughout their academic careers, and then they come to us, and then it's just kind of even more of a challenge as they're in some ways finishing up their academic careers, right? One of the big problems, and I don't want to peg this just on a generational thing, but I think it's been growing over the years or decades. It's definitely grown over the decades since I've been teaching. And I think we're seeing it more and more. I don't want to also peg everything on COVID, but I think in a lot of ways, COVID kind of accelerated some of the issues that we see with this. But we've got students who come to us with the belief that the grade is the goal, right? The belief that, what do I need to do to get an A in this class, right? And that is their focus, right? And that is obviously the wrong focus. That's not the focus we want them to have. We want them to focus on what are they going to learn through this class, right? The grade is just a representation, supposedly, of what you've learned. So they're asking the wrong question, right? But they've been trained to ask the wrong question for 12, 14, 18 years, right? Another issue with traditional grading models is the anxiety issue, and it's built into this first one, right? Where students feel a lot of anxiety about their grades. And then this is amplified for first generation students. This is amplified for disadvantaged students. This is amplified for underprepared students as well, right? Because they're already they've been put behind the curve, right? They've already been abused by the system, and then these grades give them even more anxiety as they're trying to grow and improve. I think, and as the picture shows here, this is a little facetious of me, but I used to see this when I did actual physical papers in class, where I'd give back the paper with the grade and with all the feedback, and then I'd walk out of the classroom, and the garbage can next to the door would have a bunch of student papers in it, which meant they're looking at the grade and then they're dumping it off, right? And I think we probably have all gotten that sense that even if we do a lot of feedback in Brightspace or in any other way, they're still probably only looking at the grade a lot of the time, right? They're ignoring all of that feedback, which is obviously in our minds what's really important. And then we've created this sense of kind of this indirection about incentives, right? And so we have more grade disputes when we give grades. There's all this negotiation about late work, and can I turn in this late, and can I catch up on this? And then there's all those questions about extra credit as well, right? I did poorly on the test. I did poorly on the essay. So what's some extra credit I can do to make it up, right? Because again, it's not the learning that's important, it's the grade that's important. So just some issues that we've had for a long time with grades. This idea of alternative grading has been around for a good while, but it took a lot of steam, especially around the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic, when people were really starting to, a lot more people were focusing on student anxiety, student pressure, student concerns, as well as faculty pressure and concerns and the time management and those sort of issues. So these ideas of alternative grading give us a different starting point. They put us back at square one, a blank slate, right? And they try to shift the focus back from evaluation with that grade to figuring out how students can provide us with evidence of their learning. And so it sounds like a small shift, and it is kind of a small shift that then takes us in a very different direction, right? But making that shift can have some pretty substantial effects, right? It can reduce what is often can become an adversarial dynamic between faculties and students, right? If I'm the one giving you a grade, you're kind of looking at me as the person who kind of holds your future in his hands, right? It also moves the rigor of the course to the front end, right? And this is more rigor in terms of the faculty, because most of these models do require a little more work up front instead of throughout the semester with all of the grading, right? They decrease the amount of time you have to spend on the actual grading, but they do often require a little more startup planning. So I'm going to talk about 4 specific models. You'll see a lot of overlap in these. And another thing you'll see is that these are almost more like puzzles that you can take apart and kind of rebuild together, right? So you can take a piece from this and put it together with this model, and you can mix and match these things, right? Which is really what I've been doing a lot with my grading. It's a little bit of 2 or 3 of these different models kind of put back together. All right, so the first one I'm going to talk about, and this is probably the one that requires the least change to the way you approach your classes and structure your classes, which is called contract grading, right? And the main idea behind contract grading is that at the beginning of the semester, you talk to the students and you basically say, here is what you need to do to get a C in this class, right? And it's probably going to be a list of activities and assignments and expectations, right? You'll notice that these are really focused on the work they do as opposed to the quality of the work. And all of these models are really going to shift that focus, and they're going to focus more on evaluation of effort versus evaluation of quality. So with contract grading, you've basically got these models that say, here's what you need to do to get a C in this class. And that's probably going to be the basic workload for the class, right? Do all of the readings, do all of these assignments, take all the quizzes, right? And if you do all of that, show up, whatever the case may be, you'll get a C for the class, right? If you make a good effort for all of those things, you can get a C for the class. If you want to get a B for the class, you need to do all of those things plus some other things as well. So maybe it's going to be, if it's a writing class, maybe you need to do 1 or 2 significant revisions to your writing assignments, right? And if you do all of that plus those, then you qualify for a B for the class. And then an A is just going to be asking even more of the students. So maybe it's a special assignment, maybe it's a special kind of engagement. And basically what you're doing is you're telling the student, you get to choose the amount of effort you're going to put into this class, right? If you put in the bare minimum that I've got in the syllabus, you're going to end up with a C for the class. And for some students, for some classes, that may be okay, right? And then you're giving them options for what they can do to improve that final grade in the long run. So one thing this does for you is it shifts us, and all of these models really do this. It shifts you from being a judge of, you give me work and I'm going to tell you how good or bad it is, right? To being a coach. You're kind of coaching the students along and saying, hey, you're keeping up with this stuff. That's great. Why don't you push yourself and maybe do one of those revisions? Because I think you can probably, pull that grade up if you want to, right? You're also shifting the grading of assignments to a binary model, right? Because instead of trying to figure out how many points out of 100 this essay gets, you're basically just saying, did you do what I asked you to do for this assignment? Yes or no, it's complete or it's not complete. Here's the feedback I'm going to give you as well, right? And in a lot of ways, you see grade disputes kind of really go down a little bit because the students know from the get-go, I'm doing what I need to do to get a B for this class, right? So it's kind of built into the structure. As long as they keep up their end of the bargain, they're going to get that grade. So that's contract grading. And like I said, that doesn't require a lot of change to the overall structure of the class. It's more just kind of changing how you introduce that at the beginning of the class and talk to the students going forward about grades. Right? Another model is spec grading or specifics grading. And the idea here is that for pretty much everything you have the students do in the class, again, we're going back to that binary model of grading. Did they complete it or did they not complete the assignment, right? But you're giving them a very detailed list of expectations for every single assignment. Right? And then when you grade it, you're grading it based on did they meet those expectations, right? And those expectations are really going to be broken down in terms of some small things. So I do like, was it turned in on time, right? Did it meet the minimum word count of 500 or 1,000 words or whatever? Did it include X number of resources? Did it follow this structure, right? And we're trying to move away from those really kind of qualitative and subjective forms of assessment of is this good, and just kind of really focusing on, in terms of the grade, does this try to do what I asked you to try to do, right? Or did you ignore did you skip all the resources, right? Did you only turn in 500 words when I asked you for 1,000 words, right? Spec grading asks the students to do a lot of revision, or it gives them a chance to do a lot of revision, right? So they're getting feedback on how much effort they put into it, and then they're being given an opportunity to revise some of those things. And one common approach or one common fear with this is that it's suddenly going to be the faculty member is going to be grading revisions and resubmitted assignments constantly throughout the semester. So one common way to deal with that is to use kind of a token model. And maybe at the beginning of the semester, you give each student either a physical token or just it's kind of a thing you keep track of, right, on paper or on Brightspace or something, maybe 6 tokens, which means they can revise up to 6 of your assignments over the course of the semester, right? And so then you're putting them in the position of making those decisions. Is this the assignment that I want to spend this token on, or do I want to kind of move on and focus on this next assignment as well? One nice thing about this, and this is part of what I do in a lot of my grading, all of my assignments have very detailed expectations of the students. So it's not just, did you turn it in on time? Did you write 500 words? But it's like detailed list of these are the expectations I have for this. And this works really well if you've got the kind of class where they're basically doing the same assignment repeatedly throughout the semester. So in my class, they've got like 6 blog posts they do over the course of the semester. It's the exact same assignment every single time. It's just a different prompt, right? But I'm asking the same effort of them each time, right? Or each learning journal they do, same thing, different prompt, but the same expectations. So they get used to that pattern. I don't have to keep changing these things. I don't have to kind of keep redesigning these models each time I assign them, right? It's the same thing. The grading becomes a lot faster because I'm grading basically on those specs. Does it meet these expectations? Was it turned in on time? Was it the right word count, right? Does it do these things? And my feedback is focused on the quality of the work, right? But the quality is not calculated into the actual grade, right? So then I can quickly go through and kind of say, yes, it meets all these expectations, and no, it doesn't meet these. And then in my feedback, I can say, hey, you're doing a great job with this. Here's where it looks like you were having some trouble. Maybe next time going forward, or if you're going to revise this, you should focus on this aspect of the assignment. And in this way, the feedback gets used because they can either use that feedback in their revision process if they choose to do that, or since it's a repetitive assignment, they can use that feedback to improve the next time around. All right, and I am moving through these fairly quickly because I want to cover them all, and then we'll leave some time for those questions as we go. Ungrading, this one's probably the one that kind of gets talked about the most recently. You hear this term. The name is a bit of a misnomer, and I think part of the reason why it gets talked about is just because of the name. It's kind of one of those things where the name's more catchy than the actual concept, right? But the idea of ungrading is really trying to make a big shift from grades to feedback, right? And the idea here is you don't put any grades on individual assignments, right? But you provide thorough feedback to every assignment for the student, right? And then ungrading really calls for a lot of reflection on the student's part. So at the end of the semester, at the very least, or maybe at the midterm point as well, they might turn in either a portfolio of their best work and a reflection on their work, or they might just do an overall self-assessment of their work, right? And then you, as the instructor, review their self-assessment, and maybe you probably agree with them, or maybe you have some issues with the way they've assessed themselves. And this is another piece that I use quite a bit. So we just did this last week. My students did a long self-assessment. They've got a Microsoft form they fill out. They answer a lot of questions about the work they did, how much effort they put into it, how much time they're putting into the class, what they think they've learned, and ultimately what grade they think they should get for their midterm, right? And then I go through, and I mean, 90% of the time I agree with what they've said, right? I always have a few who really are overly critical of themselves, right? Like I turned in one assignment late, so I deserve a C, kind of thing. And so I bump that up. And then I always have maybe one student who just has a really misaligned sense of effort, right? And they haven't done a lot of the work, but they still think, they're kind of doing pretty well. So, but most of the time I agree with their work, right? What this does for you and for the students, really, this puts metacognition at the center of the course. So they're not just thinking metacognitively about individual assignments or individual learning experiences. They're thinking metacognitively about the entire course. How much of your effort are you putting into the course? What are you getting out of the course? What are those efforts earning you as a result of those efforts, right? It also creates genuine dialogue if you do it where you're not doing any kind of grading or evaluation at all. If you're setting aside any kind of rubrics and you're just giving them that feedback, right? That completely shifts kind of the dynamic of the work you're doing with the student, right? Ungrading can also be really great for those high achievers that we all get in our classes, the ones who we know that when they get into the class, they could just coast through the class and get an A regardless, right? Ungrading is constantly challenging them to do better than they're already doing anyway. So it's a way to really kind of challenge them just the way you're challenging everybody else, right? And so they're not kind of bored or kind of pushed off to the side because they're doing so well that they're not getting any attention from you. I will note that this is probably figured out as probably the most intensive of the models that I'm talking about today. This is a pretty demanding one. This requires a pretty big shift, right? It's only going to work for certain kinds of classes as well, to be honest with you, right? But it's also the kind of thing that you could just take one example from and try out. And so you don't have to do the entire class, right? All right, one last one, and then we'll kind of move on from here. And I'm keeping an eye on the time here. Negotiated grading uses the idea of co-creation, right? So co-creation is where the students become partners in the development of the course itself. So on the first day of class, you come and say, here are the learning outcomes or objectives we need to accomplish through this class. What do you all think you can produce to demonstrate that learning, right, over the course of the semester? What kind of work are you going to do to demonstrate that you've learned these different outcomes or objectives, right? And then for the first couple of weeks of class, there's a lot of time where the students are actually kind of working with you in partnership to figure out this plan. Here's what we're going to try to accomplish. Here's what we're going to produce as evidence of that accomplishment. This creates a real kind of living syllabus sense of things, right? Students become partners and really owners of the class, right? But it's also the kind of thing where every time you teach the class, it's probably going to be different because you've got a different dynamic with the students as well. Negotiated grading also calls for grading conferences. And I think this is a great idea. This is something I'm going to start doing going forward. This is not something I'm doing right now, especially because I've got an asynchronous class, which doesn't work too well with this. But the idea is that the students would come in at midterm and then at the end of the semester, and they would bring in their evidence of learning, right? And they would come in basically with their argument for this is why I think you should, give me an A for the midterm or for the final class. And you kind of come in with your sense of the effort they've put into the class. And then you have a discussion about that. This works really well, obviously, at midterm because you can catch those students who are struggling a little bit and get them back on track by actually talking to them about where they're struggling and how they're struggling. Another reason this is great is because this gives students practice in a skill that I think many college students graduate without having, which is how to argue for something you want, right? So we do a lot of stuff in college about formal oral communication skills, right? Give us a presentation, right? Memorize this script, put together these slides, present this, and there's importance to that, right? We spend a lot less time focusing on interpersonal skills where you sit down with somebody and say, this is the salary I think you should give me if you're going to hire me. This is the bonus I think you should give me for doing a good job over the past year when they're meeting with their bosses. So this is a way for them to practice that as they're discussing these grades with you. But any kind of co-creation does a lot of student buy-in because the students become partners and even kind of co-owners of the course itself. And so you see this kind of dynamic shift where suddenly they're committed to the ideas that they have bought into and created with you, right? It can also be a great way for you to figure out if the course itself is a little bit misaligned, if maybe the things you think you're teaching the students are not necessarily the things you're actually teaching them, because they're the ones coming up with the evidence of learning, right? And so they're seeing it from a different angle, and they might be interpreting what you're teaching them a little bit differently. So this is an interesting way to kind of assess that alignment, right? This obviously requires a ton of work early on, right? Because those first couple of weeks of class, you're kind of out in the wilderness building the class with the students, right? So that there is a lot of work to do at the beginning as this gets going. Okay, I'm going to move through this real quickly. A lot of you have heard us talk about the TILT framework before, right? The TILT framework is transparency in learning and teaching. It's been around for 10 or 12 years now. This is proven through study after study to help students perform better and demonstrate their learning more accurately by providing them with 3 thorough pieces of information on any task you're asking them to do, right? Give them the purpose. Why are you asking them to do this? What is this assignment going to assess? How does this assignment fit into the bigger picture of the class? How does it fit into the bigger picture of the curriculum? And how will it help them even in their future endeavors? The task gives them a detailed outline of this process you want them to go through to complete this activity. So it's not write me an essay and use 3 sources. This is here's step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, right? Detailed outline of the process you want them to follow. And then criteria about how it's going to be assessed accurately. Right? So like I said, this has been studied time and time again, and it's always found to significantly improve student performance, not because they're necessarily learning more, and it's not because you're just providing them extra help, but what you're doing is making sure there's no confusion, because we've all had students turn in good work where they misunderstood part of the assignment, right? And then if you're using a really rigorous rubric or something, you're often having to downgrade them because they just misunderstood or didn't understand something you expected them to understand. And so the TILT framework really tries to address that gap in knowledge between what we think an assignment should be and what they think an assignment should be. And again, the research has shown that in particular for first generation students and historically underrepresented students, this has a pretty dramatic effect on their performance, because again, if they're coming to us without having that background understanding of how college works, right? We're explaining it to them in this assignment as opposed to just expecting them to know it, right? So like I said, CAT's done a lot of workshops on the TILT framework, but I think for all of these alternative grading models, you've got to really be thorough and detailed in your expectations for the students. All right, just some challenges to wrap up. Some students have a very kind of misaligned, like I said, understanding of these things, right? And they think if they do the bare minimum, that is kind of maximum reward, right? So sometimes we need to kind of realign those things. I'll be honest, you do need to be aware of kind of campus constraints. So what's your department going to kind of say about this? What is what is the dean going to kind of think about this kind of thing? What is rank and tenure going to think about this? We have a lot of folks on faculty who still think that the grade for every class just magically falls into this normal distribution and has to, until the end of time, right? If you do this alternative grading, you're not going to have that bell curve of a distribution. It's going to be very different, right? And so at the very least, you need to be prepared to explain kind of why that is the case, right? This can be a little stressful for students at the beginning if they've never experienced this before. I always have a few students who in the first couple of weeks of class think I'm just going to pull the rug out from under them and, give them like bad grades at the end of the semester as a surprise or something, right? But usually by about week 4, they're really kind of into this. By midterms, they're really kind of understanding how it all works and much more comfortable with it as well. But it can be a little stressful for the students who've been really kind of built on, this is how you get an A in the class. This can be a little stressful for them, right? And then you do need to be aware that any LMS is designed to work with the traditional model of grading points and letters, right? And doing anything else can be done, but you need to kind of play with it a little bit. So I've become a real, I think, expert in how to manipulate the grade book and Brightspace to make some of this stuff work for me, mostly, right? All right. Like I said, you don't have to dive into the deep end with this. If you want to kind of play with it, maybe pick one assignment and grade it on spec only, right? Or maybe do a grading conference toward the end of the semester with the students, or just take one assignment and apply that tilt framework to it to see how that changes the student's understanding of the assignment itself. Or just come talk to us at CAT. Wrap up here when say that the challenge is about the learning, not the grade, right? The rigor is in the learning, not in the grade that you get, right? And so this is one way to try to refocus that in your classes. I've got a bunch of resources up on our CAT wiki. If you just search on alternative grading, it'll pop up, right? And now I think I can take some questions. So thank you all.